Marcus Chun's hands were still sticky with the billionaire's blood when the CEO cornered him in the elevator and offered him $50,000 to forget what her dying father had whispered. His answer would either make him rich beyond his wildest dreams or paint a target on his back that money couldn't erase. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Marcus Chun had been invisible for 17 years. Not literally, of course, but in the way that truly mattered in the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district. He wore the navy blue uniform of Sterling Global Solutions, pushed a gray industrial cart through hallways that cost more per square foot than his entire apartment, and existed in that peculiar space reserved for people whose work is essential, but whose presence is meant to go unnoticed. At 52, Marcus had perfected the art of being unseen. He knew which executives preferred their offices clean before dawn, which traders left half-eaten takeout that would stink by morning, and which conference rooms hosted meetings so sensitive that he was expected to wear noise-canceling headphones while he emptied the trash. He had signed more non-disclosure agreements than most lawyers, all of them promising the same thing: what you see here, what you hear here stays here. For 17 years he had kept that promise without question, until the night of October 14th, when everything changed. It started ordinarily enough. Marcus clocked in at his usual time, 9:30 in the evening, just as the last of the junior analysts were packing up their designer messenger bags and heading out to whatever overpriced bars they frequented. The 47th floor was his domain after hours, home to Sterling's executive suites and the inner sanctum where billion-dollar decisions were made over imported coffee and leather-bound agendas. He began his rounds in the usual order. First, the reception area with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a view that never failed to make him pause, if only for a moment. Then the junior partner offices, most of them neat because their occupants were still hungry enough to care about impressions. As he worked, his mind wandered to his daughter Sophie, asleep in their small apartment in Queens. 19 years old and in her second year at community college, working 2 jobs to help with tuition. She wanted to be a teacher, had the patience and heart for it. Everything he did, every late shift, every weekend worked, was for her. The senior partners' offices were different. These were spaces that reeked of arrived success, the kind of wealth that no longer needed to prove anything. Marcus had cleaned Ronald Sterling's corner office for over a decade, had watched the company's founder age from a sharp-eyed titan into a frail man whose hands trembled when he signed documents. Sterling was 83 now, still came to work 3 days a week out of habit more than necessity. Everyone knew his daughter Victoria was running the show, had been for the past 5 years. Marcus pushed his cart into Sterling's office, immediately noticing something different. The old man's desk, usually meticulously organized, was a chaos of scattered papers. The leather chair was pushed back at an odd angle, and one of the desk drawers hung open. Marcus frowned. Cleaning staff had strict instructions never to touch the desk, only to dust around it. But something about the scene felt wrong, urgent in a way he couldn't name. He began with the bookshelves, working his way around the room as he always did when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the hum of the building's ventilation system. A wheeze, labored and wet, coming from behind the massive mahogany desk. Marcus's heart seized. He dropped his microfiber cloth and rushed around the desk, finding Ronald Sterling crumpled on the floor, his face ashen, his lips tinged with blue. The old man's eyes were open, desperate, his hand clutching at his chest. Training from a decade ago, before he'd been a janitor, before life had beaten him down into this uniform, kicked in. Marcus dropped to his knees, his fingers finding the old man's pulse. Weak, irregular, but there. He grabbed his phone to call for help, but Sterling's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping Marcus's wrist. The old man's mouth moved, trying to form words. Marcus leaned closer, his ear inches from Sterling's lips. Drawer, Sterling gasped, each word a monumental effort. Bottom, left, take it. Before she... His body convulsed, a violent spasm that made Marcus's stomach drop. Mr. Sterling, I'm calling an ambulance. You need to stay still. No time. The old man's grip tightened, his eyes wild with an animal fear that transcended physical pain. This was the terror of a man who knew his time had run out, who had something vitally important to communicate. Promise me. Take it. Read it. Stop her. She's going to. Another spasm cut off his words. Marcus yanked his arm free and dialed 911. His hands shaking as he gave the address, the floor, the situations. The operator's calm, professional questions felt surreal against the gasping struggle of the man dying in front of him. Help is coming, Mr. Sterling. Just hold on. Hold on. But even as he said it, Marcus watched the light fade from the old man's eyes. That terrible, unmistakable transition from alive to not, from a person to a shell. Sterling's hand fell away, his final breath escaping in a long, rattling sigh. Marcus sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had seen death before, had held his own wife's hand as cancer stole her away piece by piece. But this felt different. This felt wrong, charged with a significance that made the expensive office feel suddenly claustrophobic. The drawer, bottom left. Marcus's eyes moved to the desk, to the drawer that hung open. He shouldn't. Every instinct, every rule he'd followed for 17 years screamed at him to wait for the paramedics, to not touch anything, to remain invisible. But Sterling's words words echoed in his mind before she. Stop her. He reached for the drawer with trembling hands, pulling it fully open. Inside, beneath a stack of old corporate reports, was a thin manila envelope. No markings, no label. Marcus picked it up, the paper soft with age, and looked back at Sterling's body. The old man's face was peaceful now, whatever urgency had driven his final moments gone. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He tucked the envelope inside his uniform shirt, closed the drawer, and stood up just as the office door burst open. The next 20 minutes were a blur of paramedics, building security, and police. Marcus answered their questions mechanically. He'd come in to clean, found Mr. Sterling on the floor, called for help immediately. No, he hadn't touched anything. No, he didn't know what had happened. They took his statement, thanked him, told him he could go home. As he walked toward the service elevator, his cart abandoned in Sterling's office, Marcus felt the envelope pressed against his skin like a brand. Whatever was inside, Ronald Sterling had thought it important enough to use his dying breath to ensure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. Marcus didn't open it in the building. He didn't open it on the subway ride home, though his fingers kept drifting to his chest, confirming it was still there. It wasn't until he was in his small kitchen, the door locked, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him, that he finally broke the seal. Inside was a flash drive and a single handwritten note on personal stationery. The old man's shaking script was barely legible, but the message was clear enough to make Marcus's blood run cold. If you're reading this, I'm dead. What's on this drive will destroy Sterling Global and send my daughter to prison for the rest of her life. She's been cooking the books for 3 years, stealing from pension funds, falsifying reports to the SEC. $500 million gone, and she's planning to blame it on a cyber addict next week, which will trigger a catastrophic market crash. You have to stop her. You have to make this public. I'm a coward for not doing it myself, but I am too old, too sick, and too much of a fool who loved his daughter more than his principles. Please, don't let her destroy everything. Ronald Sterling. Marcus read the note 3 times, each pass making his hands shake harder. He inserted the flash drive into his ancient laptop, the one Sophie had bought him 2 Christmases ago, and watched as folder after folder of documents loaded. Spreadsheets, emails, transaction records, all meticulously organized, all damning. He wasn't a forensic accountant, but he'd taken enough business classes back when he had different dreams to understand what he was looking at. This wasn't creative accounting or aggressive tax strategy. This was systematic, calculated fraud on a scale that would make headlines around the world, and Ronald Sterling had entrusted it to him, to the janitor, to the Invisible Man. Marcus closed the laptop and sat in the pre-dawn darkness of his kitchen, watching the city begin to wake outside his window. In his 17 years of invisibility, he'd never wanted to be seen. Being noticed meant risk, meant complications, meant the possibility of losing the steady paycheck that kept Sophie in school and kept a roof over their heads. But now he held something that couldn't stay hidden, and he had no idea what to do. Marcus didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, watching the sky shift from black to gray to the pale blue of morning, the flash drive sitting in front of him like a live grenade. At 6:30, his phone rang. The building manager. Marcus, I know this is your day off, but we need you to come in. M.R. Sterling's office needs to be cleaned and secured. The family specifically requested you since you were the one who found him. They want to thank you personally. Marcus's throat went dry. The family? Miss Sterling? Victoria? She'll be there at 9. Can you make it? Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to call in sick, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that office. But refusing would be suspicious. Marcus had never called in sick, never missed a shift, never given anyone a reason to remember his name. I'll be there, he heard himself say. He arrived at Sterling Global at 8, giving himself time to think, to prepare. The building felt different in daylight, less like the quiet sanctuary he'd known for 17 years and more like a trap. News crews were already setting up outside, drawn by the death of one of Wall Street's legends. Marcus slipped in through the service entrance, his uniform making him invisible once more. The 47th floor was chaos. Executives huddled in tight groups, their voices low and urgent. Assistants rushed between offices with red-rimmed eyes. Marcus caught fragments of conversation as he pushed his cart toward Sterling's office. Heart attack. So sudden. What happens now? The stock price. Sterling's office had been transformed overnight. The desk was clean, papers removed. The carpet where the old man had died showed the faint indentation of his body, soon to be erased. Crime scene tape had been removed. This wasn't a crime scene anymore, after all. Just an old man who'd had a heart attack. Nothing suspicious, nothing worth investigating. Marcus began to clean mechanically, his mind racing. He'd spent half the night researching what to do with evidence of corporate fraud. The SEC had a whistleblower program that offered protection and financial rewards. But the rewards came with a price: visibility. His name would eventually become public. He would be the man who brought down Sterling Global, who cost thousands of people their jobs, who triggered market instability. And Sophie, God, what would this do to Sophie? You must be Marcus. The voice came from the doorway, smooth and controlled. Marcus turned to find Victoria Sterling standing there, elegant in a black Armani suit that probably cost more than his monthly salary. She was 45, beautiful in the way that unlimited wealth and personal trainers could manufacture. Her dark hair pulled back in a style that said power without trying too hard. Miss Sterling, Marcus said, straightening. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you. She walked into the office, her heels silent on the plush carpet, and closed the door behind her. Click of the latch felt ominous. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did last night, for trying to help my father. I just did what anyone would do, ma'am. Did you? She moved closer, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to step back. The paramedic said you performed CPR, that you stayed with him. Most people would have panicked, called for help, and left. But you stayed. Marcus's heart was pounding now, though he kept his face neutral. Like I said, anyone would have. My father was very particular about his privacy. Victoria's voice remained pleasant, conversational, but something sharp glinted beneath the surface, especially in his final years. His memory wasn't what it used to be, but he was paranoid about his papers, his files. Did he say anything to you before he died? The moment stretched between them like a tightrope. Marcus could feel the weight of the flash drive in his apartment, miles away but somehow present in this room. He tried to speak, Marcus said carefully, truthfully, but I couldn't understand him. I was focused on trying to help. Victoria studied him for another long moment, and Marcus understood with sudden clarity that this woman was dangerous. Not in an obvious way, not with threats or violence, but with the kind of power that could erase a person without anyone noticing they were gone. I see. She reached into her jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is a check for $50,000. A thank you for your service to my father and to this company. 17 years of loyal, discreet work deserves recognition. Marcus stared at the envelope, his mind reeling. $50,000. That was Sophie's tuition for the rest of college, with enough left over to finally fix the leaking ceiling in their apartment to replace his 10-year-old car. It was more money than he'd ever held at once. It was also a test. Very generous, Ems. Sterling, but I can't accept, please. She pressed the envelope into his hand, her grip firm. I insist. And Marcus, I want you to know that you'll always have a place here at Sterling Global. In fact, I'm promoting you to building superintendent. Salary of $120,000 a year, full benefits, and an office of your own. You've earned it. $120,000. That was more than double what he made now. That was security, real security, the kind that meant Sophie could quit her 2 jobs and focus on school. The kind that meant he could breathe for the first time in years. The kind that meant staying quiet about what he knew. I don't know what to say, Marcus managed, and that, at least, was true. Say yes. Victoria's smile was warm, genuine, the smile of a woman who knew she'd just bought someone's silence. You deserve this, Marcus. You're part of the Sterling Global family, and we take care of family. She left him standing there, the envelope heavy in his hand, the promotion settling on his shoulders like a chain made of gold. Marcus looked around Sterling's office, at the space where the old man had died, begging him to stop his daughter, felt the weight of an impossible choice crushing down on him. That night, Marcus sat Sophie down at their small kitchen table. She'd just gotten home from her evening shift at the diner, her hair tied back, exhaustion written in the slope of her shoulders. At 19, she shouldn't have looked so tired. She should have been out with friends, worrying about exams and boys, not whether they could afford groceries this week. Baby, I need to talk to you about something. She looked up, immediately alert, fear flashing across her face. The fear of someone who'd grown up poor, who knew how quickly everything could fall apart. What's wrong? Did you lose your job? No. The opposite, actually. He told her about the promotion, about the raise, watching her face transform from fear to disbelief to pure, radiant joy. Dad, that's incredible. Oh my God, that means I can quit the diner. That means you won't have to work weekends anymore. That means... She stopped, studying his face. Why don't you look happy? Marcus had never lied to his daughter. Even when her mother was dying and Sophie asked if Mommy would be okay, he'd told her the truth as gently as he could. He'd promised himself he would never lie to her, never treat her like she couldn't handle reality. But how could he tell her about the flash drive? How could he explain that her father held evidence that could make them both targets? That choosing to do the right thing might mean destroying the future she'd worked so hard for? I'm happy, sweetheart. Just tired. Been a long couple of days. She hugged him and he held her tight, memorizing the moment. Tomorrow he would have to decide. Tomorrow he would have to choose between the invisible life he'd built and the man he used to be. The man who'd believed that truth mattered more than comfort. But tonight, he let himself hold his daughter and pretend that $50,000 in a promotion were just blessings without strings attached. The next morning, Marcus woke to find his decision had been made for him. The news was everywhere, impossible to ignore. Sterling Global stock had plummeted overnight, triggered by a massive cyber attack that had compromised their systems. Victoria Sterling was on every channel, her face a perfect mask of controlled concern, explaining how foreign hackers had breached their defenses, how they were working with federal authorities, how this was an attack on American financial sovereignty. Marcus watched the press conference on his phone, his coffee going cold in his hand, and saw exactly what Ronald Sterling had tried to prevent. The setup was in motion. The scapegoat was being established, and in a few days or weeks, when the full extent of the missing money came to light, everyone would blame the hackers. Victoria would emerge as the steadfast leader who guided the company through crisis. The pension funds would be empty, but no one would go to prison unless someone spoke up. Marcus looked at the envelope Victoria had given him, still sitting unopened on his counter. Then he looked at the flash drive hidden in a coffee tin above his refrigerator. He thought about his daughter, About 17 years of invisibility, about an old man's dying words. He reached for his phone and began to dial the SEC whistleblower hotline. His hands were shaking, but his voice when he spoke was steady. "My name is Marcus Chun," he said, "and I have evidence of fraud at Sterling Global Solution." The invisible man had chosen to be seen. The SEC investigator's name was Rebecca Walsh, and she had the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too many frauds to be shocked by another one. She met Marcus in a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from the gleaming towers of Manhattan, far from anywhere someone from Sterling Global might accidentally spot them. "Mr. Chun," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Thank you for coming. I understand you have information about Sterling Global." Marcus pushed the flash drive across the table. His hand trembled slightly and he hated himself for it. After making the decision, he should have felt resolute. Instead, he felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff about to jump with no idea if there was water below. Walsh picked up the drive, turning it over in her fingers. "Before I look at this, I need to understand the chain of custody. Where did you get it?" "Ronald Sterling gave it to me right before he died." Her eyebrows rose. "The Ronald Sterling? You're saying he handed you this directly?" "Not exactly." Marcus explained the whole thing. Finding Sterling on the floor, the old man's desperate words, the drawer. With each sentence, Walsh's expression grew more interested and more skeptical in equal measure. "So you removed potential evidence from what could have been a crime scene," she said when he finished. "I didn't think of it as a crime scene. He had a heart attack." That's what the paramedic said. Convenient timing, though, isn't it? Right before he could blow the whistle on his own daughter. Walsh's voice wasn't accusatory, just thoughtful. "Mr. Chun, what you've brought me, if it's authentic, is explosive. You have to understand what you're walking into. Victoria Sterling has unlimited resources, the best lawyers money can buy, and a lot of powerful friends. The moment we start investigating, she'll know. And she'll come after whoever gave us this information." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "That's why I waited. That's why I almost didn't call. But you did." "Why?" Marcus thought about Sophie, about the promotion he'd never claimed, about the check he'd torn up and thrown away. He thought about 17 years of being invisible, of watching powerful people make decisions that affected thousands of lives while he emptied their trash and polished their floors. "Because someone has to," he said simply, "and because a dying man asked me to." Walsh studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, give me 3 days to analyze what's on here. Don't talk to anyone at Sterling. Don't go back to work. Tell him you're sick, tell him your daughter needs you, tell him anything. But don't set foot in that building until you hear from me." Marcus left the coffee shop feeling untethered, adrift. For 17 years, his life had run on tracks. Work, home, Sophie, sleep, repeat. Now the tracks were gone, and he was in freefall. He called Sterling Global's HR department and used 3 sick days, the first he'd taken in 5 years. Then he went home and waited. The waiting was the worst part. He cleaned the apartment twice, cooked elaborate meals Sophie barely touched because she could sense his anxiety, and checked his phone every 10 minutes like a man expecting news of his own execution. On the second day, Sophie cornered him in the kitchen. "Dad, what's going on? And don't tell me nothing. Not a kid anymore." Marcus looked at his daughter. Really looked at her. When had she grown up? When had she stopped being the little girl who needed him to check for monsters under the bed and become this perceptive young woman who could read his moods like a book? "I did something," he said slowly. "Something that might have consequences, but it was the right thing to do. How bad are the consequences? I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." Sophie reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was strong, steady, so much like her mother's it made his chest ache. "Then we'll deal with it together, whatever it is." The call came on the 3rd day, just after noon. Walsh's voice was tight with controlled excitement. "Mr. Chun, what you gave me is legitimate. We've verified it against our own intelligence and some information from other sources. This is real, and it's big. We're moving forward with a full investigation." Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. "What happens now?" "Now you become our star witness. We'll need you to give a formal deposition, testify before a grand jury, and eventually, if this goes to trial, testify in court. The whistleblower protection laws will shield you from retaliation. You'll be eligible for a monetary award if the case results in sanctions over $1 million. "I don't want money," Marcus said. "That's not why I did this, I believe you. But you should know, based on what's in these files, we're looking at potential sanctions in the hundreds of millions. Your award could be substantial, enough to change your life." After he hung up, Marcus sat in his small living room and tried to imagine what that meant. A different apartment, maybe. College tuition paid in full. A future without the constant low-level anxiety of wondering if they could afford a medical emergency or a broken appliance. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just painted a target on his back. The feeling proved prophetic. 2 days later, as Marcus was leaving the bodega near his apartment, a black sedan pulled up alongside him. The window rolled down and a man in an expensive suit leaned out. "Mr. Chun, I'm James Rothschild, General Counsel for Sterling Global. Ms. Sterling would like to speak with you." It wasn't a request. Marcus thought about running, about refusing, about calling Walsh and asking what to do, but curiosity and a strange, fatalistic bravery won out. "Okay." The sedan's back door opened. Inside, Victoria Sterling sat with her legs crossed, perfectly composed, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Get in, Marcus. Let's talk." He climbed into the car and it pulled smoothly away from the curb. The interior smelled of leather and expensive perfume. Victoria didn't speak for a long moment, just studied him with those sharp, calculating eyes. "You went to the SEC," she said finally. It wasn't a question. Marcus said nothing. His heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his face neutral. I underestimated you, Victoria continued. I thought you were smart enough to take the money and disappear. I thought you understood how things work. I understand perfectly, Marcus said, finding his voice. Your father spent his whole life building that company. You're tearing it down to line your own pocket. My father, Victoria said, her composure cracking for just an instant, revealing something raw and angry underneath, was a weak old man who couldn't accept that the world had changed. He built Sterling Global on the backs of ruthless decisions, on crushing competitors, on doing whatever it took to win. And then he got old and developed a conscience. She leaned forward. Do you know what a conscience is worth in this world, Marcus? Nothing. Less than nothing. It's a liability. Then why are you here? If you don't care what I think, why bother talking to me? Because I'm giving you one last chance. She pulled out a tablet and turned it toward him. On the screen was a photograph of Sophie walking to class at her college, her backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware she was being watched. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Don't, Victoria said, her voice soft and deadly. Don't pretend to be shocked. Don't pretend you didn't know this was a possibility. You made a choice, Marcus. You chose to involve yourself in something that was none of your business. And now your daughter pays the price. If you touch her, I won't have to touch her. Do you know how easy it is to destroy someone's life without laying a finger on them? A few well-placed rumors about academic dishonesty, an anonymous tip to immigration that she's working illegally overstaying a visa, a concerned citizen report that her father is mentally unstable and might be a danger to himself and others. Victoria's smile was arctic. I can make Sophie's life a living hell without ever coming near her. Or you can make this go away. How? Tell the SEC you made a mistake. Tell them the flash drive was corrupted, that you misunderstood what you saw, that you were grieving and confused after finding my father's body. Tell them whatever you want, but make it go away. She pulled out another check, this one for $250,000. This is yours if you do, along with the promotion. The new apartment I've already arranged for you in a nice building in Manhattan, and my personal guarantee that no harm will come to you or your daughter. Marcus looked at the check, then at the photograph of Sophie, then at Victoria's cold, confident face. She thought she'd won. She thought everyone had a price, that every man could be bought or broken. And maybe she was right. Maybe he was a fool for thinking he could fight someone with her power, her resources, her complete lack of conscience. But then he thought about Ronald Sterling dying on the floor of his office, using his last breath to try to stop this. He thought about all the people whose pension funds had been stolen, whose retirements had been destroyed, who would never know they'd been robbed if he stayed silent. Marcus took the check, and for a moment Victoria's smile widened, then he tore it in half. No, he said simply. The smile vanished. You're making a terrible mistake, probably, but it's my mistake to make. He reached for the door handle. And Victoria, your father was a better person than you'll ever be. He stepped out of the car onto a busy street in Queens, his legs shaking, his heart racing. As the sedan pulled away, he pulled out his phone and called Walsh. They made contact, he said, and we're going to need protection for my daughter. The federal protection came swiftly, but it felt like a cage. Two agents, one named Martinez and one named Chun, no relation, moved into Marcus's building, taking the apartment across the hall. Sophie had to change her routine, vary her routes to class, report any unusual activity. The spontaneity of her life evaporated overnight, replaced by hypervigilance and fear. Dad, is this really necessary? She asked one evening, watching through the window as Agent Martinez made his rounds of the building's perimeter. Can't we just go to the police? Marcus wanted to tell her yes, that the police could handle it, that everything would be fine. But he'd learned in the past week that Victoria Sterling's reach extended far beyond what he'd imagined. She sat on charitable boards with the police commissioner. Her company donated millions to the district attorney's re-election campaign. The normal channels of justice were, if not completely corrupted, at least compromised enough to be unreliable. The SEC has jurisdiction, he explained. Not for the first time, and they're taking this seriously. We just have to wait for the investigation to finish. But waiting, Marcus was learning, was its own form of torture. The deposition took 3 days, 12 hours of answering questions, of walking investigators through every detail of that night, of explaining over and over why he'd taken the flash drive, why he'd waited, why he'd finally come forward. The lawyers were polite but relentless, poking holes in his timeline, questioning his motives, making sure his story could withstand the brutal cross-examination that would inevitably come if this went to trial. On the 4th day after his encounter with Victoria, the first story appeared. It was in a tabloid. Nothing respectable, just a gossip rag that most people dismissed. But the headline made Marcus's blood run cold. Disgraced janitor fabricates evidence in desperate bid for attention. The article painted him as a troubled man with a history of mental health issues, someone who'd become obsessed with his employer, who'd stolen documents and fabricated evidence as part of an elaborate revenge fantasy. It cited anonymous sources within Sterling Global who described him as erratic, paranoid, and possibly dangerous. There was even a grainy photograph, clearly taken from security footage, of Marcus in Ronald Sterling's office, his hand reaching toward the desk drawer. It's character assassination, Walsh explained when Marcus called her, his hands shaking with rage and fear. Classic corporate defense strategy. They're trying to poison the jury pool, discredit you before the case even gets to court. But it's all lies. I don't have a history of mental health issues. I've never been anything but professional. It doesn't matter. The seed is planted. People will remember the headline even if they never read the article. even if it's all eventually proven false. Walsh's voice softened. I'm sorry, Marcus. I warned you this would get ugly. The story spread. By the end of the week, it had been picked up by more mainstream outlets couched in careful language about allegations and questions. But the damage was done. Marcus's face was everywhere, his name associated with fraud and instability. Sophie came home from class in tears after someone recognized her, after whispers followed her down the hallway. They're saying you're crazy, she sobbed. They're saying you made the whole thing up for money. Marcus held his daughter while she cried, feeling the weight of his decision crushing down on them both. He'd known there would be consequences, but knowing it intellectually was different from living through the reality of watching his child suffer because of a choice he'd made. That night, lying awake in the dark, Marcus allowed himself to wonder if he'd been wrong. Maybe he should have taken the money. Maybe he should have stayed invisible. Who was he to think he could take down someone like Victoria Sterling? He was just a janitor, cleaned floors, he emptied trash. He wasn't a hero in some movie where the little guy always won. But then he thought about the files on that flash drive, about the faces of the people whose retirement savings had been stolen, and he knew he couldn't have made any other choice. Even if it destroyed him, even if it destroyed everything, some things were worth fighting for. The grand jury convened in the second week. Marcus testified for 6 hours, walking them through the evidence, answering questions from prosecutors who were building their case with meticulous care. The jury's faces were impassive, giving nothing away, but Marcus could feel their skepticism. He was, after all, just a janitor making wild accusations against one of the most powerful women in finance. When he finished, Walsh walked him out to the hallway. You did good, she said. The evidence speaks for itself. If they're objective, they look at what's actually in those files, they'll indict. And if they're not objective, Walsh didn't answer, which was answer enough. Indictment came down on a Friday morning, delivered like a thunderbolt that shook the financial world. Victoria Sterling was charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other counts that carried potential sentences totaling over 100 years. The news broke at 9 a.m., and by 9:30, Sterling Global's stock had cratered, wiping out billions in market value. By noon, 3 board members had resigned. By the end of the day, federal agents were executing search warrants at Sterling's headquarters, carrying out boxes of evidence while news cameras captured every moment. Marcus watched it all on television from his apartment, feeling strangely disconnected from the chaos he'd unleashed. This was real. This was actually happening. The invisible man had been seen, and the world was shaking from it. His phone rang constantly. News organizations wanting interviews, lawyers offering to represent him, strangers calling to either praise or threaten him. He ignored them all except for Walsh's calls, which came with updates and warnings in equal measure. Victoria posted bail within 2 hours, Walsh told him. $10 million like it was nothing. Her lawyers are already filing motions, attacking everything. And Marcus, you need to be very careful. She's cornered now, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. The first attempt came 3 days later. Marcus was walking back from the bodega, Agent Martinez trailing discreetly behind him, when a car jumped the curb. It happened so fast that Marcus barely had time to register the vehicle accelerating toward him before Martinez tackled him out of the way. They hit the ground hard, Marcus's shoulders screaming in pain as they rolled. The car smashed into a streetlight pole where Marcus had been standing a second earlier, the impact loud enough to bring people running from nearby buildings. The driver was gone by the time police arrived. The car stolen. No witnesses who could identify them. It could have been an accident, a drunk driver, a medical emergency, but Marcus knew better, and so did Martinez. We're moving you, the agent said, his professional calm cracked by genuine concern. Both of you. Safe house, undisclosed location, until the trial, Sophie protested. She had classes, exams, a life that couldn't just be put on hold. But one look at her father's pale face, at the way his hands wouldn't stop shaking, and she stopped arguing. They moved that night, leaving behind everything familiar for a small house in suburban New Jersey that smelled of artificial air freshener and other people's lives. It had 3 bedrooms, bars on the windows, and 2 agents on constant rotation. It was, Marcus thought with bitter irony, the nicest place he'd ever lived, and he was effectively a prisoner in it. Days blurred into weeks. Sophie took her classes online, the spark slowly draining from her eyes. Marcus read, watched television, and waited for the trial date that kept getting pushed back as Victoria's lawyers filed motion after motion. The isolation was suffocating, but worse was the guilt. He'd done this to Sophie. He'd taken her normal life and replaced it with this existence of fear and uncertainty. Do you regret it? She asked him one evening. They were sitting in the small backyard, the spring air finally warm enough to be outside. Agent Chun was visible through the kitchen window, always watching, always there. Marcus thought about the question, really thought about it. Did he regret it? He regretted the cost, the price Sophie was paying, the way their lives had been torn apart. But the action itself, the choice to speak up? No, he said finally. I don't regret it. I just wish you didn't have to pay for my choices. I'm proud of you, Dad. Sophie's voice was soft but certain. I'm scared. And I'm angry that we have to live like this, but I'm proud. Okay, you taught me that doing the right thing matters even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Marcus pulled his daughter close, grateful beyond words for her strength, for her understanding, for the woman she was becoming despite everything. The trial date was finally set for August, 3 months away. 3 more months of waiting, of watching the calendar, of wondering if Victoria would try again. 3 more months of living in limbo, suspended between his old invisible life and whatever came next. But Marcus Chun was patient. He'd spent 17 years being invisible, learning to wait, learning to endure. He could wait a little longer for justice. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus was sitting in the safe house on a humid June morning when Walsh called with news that made his pulse quicken. "We've got another witness," she said, the excitement barely contained in her voice. David Abrams, Sterling Global's former chief financial officer. He was forced out 2 years ago, signed an ironclad NDA, but he's willing to break it. Says he can corroborate everything on that flash drive. Marcus sat up straighter. What made him come forward? He saw what Victoria tried to do to you. The hit and run, the character assassination. He said he's watched her destroy too many lives and he can't stay silent anymore. Walsh paused. Marcus, his testimony changes everything. He's got credibility, institutional knowledge, and he kept his own records. With him backing up your evidence, Victoria's defense falls apart. For the first time in months, Marcus allowed himself to feel something close to hope. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just a janitor with an implausible story. He had an ally. Someone from inside the machine who could validate everything he'd risked his life to expose. But hope, Marcus was learning, was a dangerous thing. David Abrams lived in Connecticut in a sprawling colonial house that spoke of old money and careful investments. The FBI arranged the meeting, wanting to get his formal statement on record before Victoria's lawyers could intimidate him into silence. Marcus wasn't supposed to be there, but Walsh thought it might be valuable for the two whistleblowers to meet, to coordinate their stories, to present a united front. They drove out on a Tuesday, Marcus wedged in the back of an unmarked sedan with Agent Martinez at the wheel. The countryside was green and lush, so different from the urban landscape Marcus had known his entire life. In another world, this might have been a pleasant drive. In this one, every car that passed felt like a potential threat. Abrams met them at the door. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired and distinct, wearing a cardigan that made him look like someone's kindly professor. His handshake was firm, his eyes warm with genuine gratitude. "Mr. Chun," he said, "I owe you an apology. I should have done what you did years ago. I was too much of a coward." "You're doing it now," Marcus replied. "That's what matters." They sat in Abrams's study, a room lined with books and framed photographs of grandchildren. Walsh set up her recording equipment while Agent Martinez positioned himself by the window, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line around the property. "Tell me everything," Walsh said to Abrams. From the beginning, Abrams's story was damning. He explained how Victoria had started small, skimming money from accounts that were unlikely to be audited, hiding the theft in complex financial instruments that only a handful of people could understand. When her father started asking questions, she'd promoted Abrams, brought him into her confidence, made him complicit, and when he'd finally threatened to go to the board, she'd manufactured a sexual harassment claim that destroyed his reputation and forced him out with an NDA that threatened criminal prosecution if he ever spoke about company business. "I have copies of everything," Abrams said, gesturing to a safe built into the wall behind his desk. Emails, transaction records, recordings of conversations where Victoria explicitly discussed the fraud. "I kept them as insurance in case she ever came after. But insurance is worthless if you never use it." He stood to open the safe, and in that moment everything went wrong. The window exploded inward in a shower of glass. Agent Martinez went down without a sound, blood blooming across his chest. Walsh screamed, diving behind the desk. Marcus froze, his mind unable to process what was happening, the sheer impossible violence of it. Abrams never made it to the safe. The second shot caught him in the back and he crumpled, his hand outstretched toward the metal door that held all his carefully preserved evidence. Down. Walsh was pulling Marcus to the floor, her gun drawn, her training taking over even as Marcus's world splintered into chaos and terror. "Stay down." More gunshots, rapid fire, coming from multiple directions. Walsh returned fire through the shattered window, then grabbed her phone, calling for backup with a voice that was steady despite the insanity surrounding them. Marcus crawled to Abrams, his hands shaking, pressing down on the wound in the man's back. Blood. So much blood, hot and slick against his palms. Abrams's eyes were open, unfocused, his mouth working soundlessly. "Stay with me," Marcus heard himself saying, the words hollow and desperate. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." But Abrams's eyes were already glazing over, the life draining out of him in pulsing waves that Marcus couldn't stop no matter how hard he pressed. This was his fault. Brahms had come forward because of him, and now he was dying because of him. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started. Walsh was on her phone, her voice clipped and professional, coordinating with the backup that was screaming toward them from multiple directions. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Marcus held Abrams's hand, felt the moment the man's grip went slack, and knew they'd just lost their star witness. The aftermath was a blur of paramedics and federal agents, of crime scene investigators and questions Marcus couldn't begin to answer. Agent Martinez was alive, barely, rushed to surgery with injuries that would end his career if not his life. Abrams was dead, his safe unopened, its contents now evidence in a murder investigation. Walsh was furious, pacing the hospital waiting room like a caged animal. "It was a professional hit," she said, more to herself than to Marcus. "Military precision, multiple shooters, planned and executed perfectly. Victoria didn't just hire some street thugs. She hired the best." Can you prove it was her? Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. His hands were still shaking. Abrams's blood dried to a rust brown on his palms despite washing them 3 times. Not yet. The shooters are probably already out of the country, but Marcus, this changes the calculus. She's not just defending herself anymore. She's eliminating threats. And you're the biggest threat she has left. They moved Marcus again that night, this time to a federal facility that looked more like a prison than a safe house. Sophie was brought in separately, her face pale with shock when she saw him. She didn't ask what happened. She just held him while he shook, while the magnitude of what they were facing finally, truly sank in. We're going to withdraw you from the case, Walsh said the next morning. She looked exhausted, years older than she had just days ago. For your safety and Sophie's, Abrams's death makes it too dangerous. We'll find another way to prosecute Victoria. No, the word came out flat, final. Marcus, be reasonable. She's already killed 1 witness. She tried to kill you once. She won't hesitate to try again. I know, but if I back out now, David Abrams died for nothing. Agent Martinez got shot for nothing. Every person whose pension Victoria stole gets cheated out of justice. Marcus stood up, forcing his legs to steady, forcing his voice to stay calm. I'm not withdrawing. I'm testifying. You'll be killed, maybe, but I'll be heard first, and that's all that matters. Walsh stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Okay, but we do this my way. Maximum security, protocols I've never used before, resources I'm gonna have to beg for. You don't go anywhere, see anyone, do anything without my explicit approval. Agreed? Agreed. Sophie grabbed his arm. Dad, you can't be serious. She's right. They'll kill you. Marcus took his daughter's face in his hands, looking into eyes so much like her mother's it made his heart ache. Baby, do you remember what your mom used to say about why she became a teacher? Sophie's voice was thick with tears. Because silence is the enemy of progress. That's right. And I've been silent for 17 years. I can't be silent anymore. Even if speaking up costs me everything. He pulled her close, feeling her tears soak into his shirt. I need you to be strong for both of us. Can you do that? She nodded against his chest, her arms tight around him. In that moment, Marcus understood with crystal clarity that this was bigger than him, bigger than his fear, bigger than the comfortable and visible life he'd built. This was about what kind of world Sophie would inherit. A world where the powerful could destroy lives without consequence, or a world where even a janitor could stand up and demand justice. He chose the world where justice mattered, whatever the cost. The prosecution team arrived at the federal facility on a sweltering July morning. There were 5 of them, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Morrison, a woman in her early 40s with steel gray eyes and a reputation for never losing a case. She shook Marcus's hand with the grip of someone assessing a weapon, deciding if it would hold up under fire. Miss Chun, let's be honest with each other, she said, spreading files across the conference table. David Abrams's murder has complicated our case significantly. He had institutional credibility, decades of experience in finance, a pristine reputation before Victoria destroyed it. You're a janitor with a high school education and a story that sounds, to the average person, almost too convenient. Marcus had expected this, but hearing it stated so bluntly still stung. I'm telling the truth. I believe you. The evidence supports you. But truth and believability aren't always the same thing in a courtroom. Morrison pulled out a thick binder, placing it in front of him. Victoria's defense team is the best money can buy. They're going to tear into every aspect of your life, your credibility, your motives. They're going to paint you as an opportunist, a liar, maybe even suggest you're the one who killed Abrams to eliminate a competing witness. Sophie, sitting beside Marcus, gasped. That's insane. That's defense strategy, Morrison replied coolly. Nothing is off limits. So we need to prepare. I need to know everything about you, Marcus. Every mistake you've ever made, every lie you've ever told, every vulnerability they could exploit. Because if I don't know it, they will, and they'll use it to destroy you on the stand. The preparation was brutal. For 2 weeks, Morrison and her team dissected Marcus's life with surgical precision. They dug into his childhood in Philadelphia, his failed attempts at college, his marriage to Sophie's mother, her death from cancer. They found his drunk driving arrest from 20 years ago, a stupid mistake when he was 32 and drowning in grief. Charges eventually dropped, but still on record. They found the 3 months he'd been unemployed in 2015, fired from a previous janitorial job for a dispute with a supervisor that Marcus had mostly forgotten about. Each discovery felt like a violation, like watching strangers rifle through his most private memories and hold them up to harsh light, but Morrison was relentless. They'll use the drunk driving arrest to suggest you have substance abuse problems, she explained. They'll use your termination in 2015 to paint a pattern of conflict with authority. They'll dig into your wife's medical bills and suggest you're motivated purely by money, that this is all an elaborate scheme to pay off debt. None of that is true, Marcus said, his frustration boiling over. I made one mistake with alcohol 20 years ago. I got fired because I reported my supervisor for stealing, and my wife's medical bills were paid off years ago through fundraising and help from our church. I know, and we'll establish all of that. But you need to understand what you're walking into. Morrison's voice softened slightly. The courtroom is a battlefield, Marcus, and you're going to be standing in the middle of it, alone, while very expensive lawyers try to destroy you. You need to be ready. He wasn't ready. Marcus knew it in his bones, but he also knew that ready or not, he was going to do this. The media attention intensified as the trial date approached. The story had every element that made for compelling headlines. Wealth fraud, murder, and at the center of it all, a janitor taking on a billionaire. Marcus became a reluctant symbol, his face appearing on magazine covers with titles like The Whistleblower Who Wouldn't Be Silenced and David vs. Goliath. Can one man take down Wall Street? Support came from unexpected places. A GoFundMe appeared, raising money for Sophie's education despite Marcus's protest. Letters arrived at the federal facility, thousands of them, from people across the country sharing their own stories of being exploited by the powerful, of wanting to speak up but being too afraid. Marcus read every single one, drawing strength from the knowledge that he wasn't just fighting for himself or even for Abrams. He was fighting for all the invisible people who kept the world running, while those at the top stole and lied and faced no consequences. But with support came hatred. Death threats flooded in, vicious and explicit. Some promised to kill Marcus. Others threatened Sophie, describing in graphic detail what they would do to her. The FBI investigated each one, but Morrison warned him that many would never be traced. Anonymous voices in the darkness emboldened by the internet's shield. Don't read them, Sophie begged after finding him hunched over his laptop at 2 in the morning, his face pale as he scrolled through the latest batch. Dad, they're just trolls. They're not real. They feel real, Marcus whispered. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm putting you through this for nothing? Sophie took the laptop away, closing it firmly. You're not wrong. Tori Sterling is a criminal, and you're the only one brave enough to say it out loud. Don't let these cowards make you doubt that. At 19, she'd become his anchor, his strength when his own faltered. Marcus wondered when the roles had reversed, when his daughter had become the parent comforting the child. He was proud of her and devastated for her in equal measure. 10 days before the trial, Walsh brought news that sent a chill through the entire prosecution team. We've identified one of the shooters from the Abrams hit, she said, her face grim. Former Special Forces, dishonorably discharged, works as a contractor for hire. He was picked up at an airport in Argentina on an unrelated warrant, and he's talking. Marcus leaned forward. What's he saying? That he was hired through a third party, paid in cryptocurrency, given detailed intelligence on Abrams's location and security protocols. He doesn't know who the ultimate client was, but the level of resources and information involved points to someone with significant means. Walsh paused. The problem is, it's not enough to directly tie Victoria to the murder. Her lawyers insulated her through multiple layers, but it does establish a pattern. She's willing to kill to protect herself. Morrison paced the room, her mind clearly working through the implication. Can we use his testimony? The defense will fight it. They'll argue it's prejudicial, that there's no proven connection to their client. But yes, I think we can get at least some of it admitted. It shows consciousness of guilt, establishes the stakes. Walsh turned to Marcus. But it also means you need to be even more careful. If she was willing to kill Abrams, someone with far more resources and protection than you, she won't hesitate to try again. The security around Marcus tightened to the point of suffocation. He couldn't go outside without 3 agents. His phone calls were monitored. His mail was screened. Sophie's movements were even more restricted. Her online classes now her only connection to the world beyond the safe house. They were prisoners in everything but name, and the walls seemed to close in a little more each day. One evening, Marcus found Sophie sitting on her bed, staring at a framed photograph of her mother. Tears streamed silently down her face. I miss her, she said when Marcus sat beside her. Keep thinking about what she'd say if she could see all this. If she'd think we were doing the right thing. Marcus took the photograph, looking at his wife's smiling face, remembering the woman who'd believed so fiercely in justice, in speaking truth to power, in never accepting that the world couldn't be better than it was. She'd be proud of us, he said, his voice thick. Scared for us, definitely, but proud. How do you know? Because she taught me something important. She said that character isn't what you do when it's easy and everyone's watching. It's what you do when it's hard and you're all alone. He put his arm around Sophie's shoulders. We're not alone, though. We have each other and we have her memory. That's enough. The night before the trial, Marcus couldn't sleep. He stood at the barred window of the safe house, watching the stars through gaps in the security shutters, thinking about the morning that would change everything. In less than 12 hours, he would walk into a courtroom and tell his story. Victoria Sterling would be there, surrounded by her lawyers, her power, her absolute confidence that money could buy anything, including freedom from consequences. But Marcus had something she didn't. He had the truth, and he had nothing left to lose except his integrity. And that he'd already decided was something he would die before surrendering. Tomorrow, the Invisible Man would be seen by the whole world. And whatever happened after that, at least he would have spoken. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was a fortress of marble and steel, its steps lined with news cameras and reporters shouting questions into the humid August air. Marcus arrived in an armored vehicle, surrounded by so many federal agents that he could barely see the crowd beyond the wall of dark suits and earpieces. The shouting was a wall of sound, questions bleeding into each other until they became meaningless noise. Inside, the courthouse was cool and quiet, the kind of institutional silence that felt heavy with history. Marcus had never been in a federal courthouse before. The ceiling soared overhead, carved with Latin phrases he couldn't read. His footsteps echoed on the polished floors, each step feeling like a countdown. Catherine Morrison met him outside courtroom 14, her expression unreadable. Remember everything we discussed. Answer only the questions asked. Don't volunteer information. Don't let them make you angry. And Marcus, no matter what they say about you, no matter what they imply, you keep your composure. The jury's watching everything. Single quotes. Marcus nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Through the courtroom doors, he could hear the murmur of voices, the rustling of papers, the ambient sound of justice preparing to unfold. One more thing, Morrison said, her hand on his arm. You're going to see her in there. Victoria Sterling. Don't look at her. Don't engage. She doesn't exist for you. The only people who matter are the jury. Understand? He understood. But understanding and execution were different things. The courtroom was smaller than he'd imagined, more intimate. Every seat was filled, spectators packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces a blur of curiosity and judgment. Marcus saw Sophie in the front row behind the prosecution table, flanked by 2 agents. She gave him a small, terrified smile that broke his heart. And then he saw Victoria. She sat at the defense table, perfectly composed in a navy suit that probably cost more than Marcus's annual salary. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup subtle, her expression one of calm patience. She looked like a woman waiting for a minor inconvenience to pass, not someone facing life in prison. And when Marcus's eyes accidentally met hers, she smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A smile that said, "You can't win." Judge Margaret Chun, no relation to Marcus, entered from her chambers. She was in her 60s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. Everyone rose, the sound of 100 people standing in unison, and then she was seated, and they were seated. And it was beginning. Jury selection had taken 3 days, 12 people and 4 alternates chosen from a pool of hundreds. Morrison had briefed Marcus on each one. Juror 3 was a retired postal worker. Juror 7 was a school teacher. Juror 11 ran a small bakery in Brooklyn. These were regular people, the kind of people Marcus had been invisible to his entire life. Now his fate rested in their hands. Morrison's opening statement was precise and devastating. She walked the jury through the evidence methodically, painting a picture of systematic fraud that had robbed thousands of people of their retirement savings. She explained how Victoria Sterling had used her position to steal, to lie, to manipulate financial records with the kind of sophisticated criminality that most people couldn't even comprehend. And how do we know all this? Morrison said, turning to gesture at Marcus. Because a dying man entrusted evidence to someone he knew had integrity. Marcus Chun wasn't looking to be a hero. He was just doing his job when Ronald Sterling, with his last breath, asked him to do the right thing. And despite threats, despite attempts on his life, despite a coordinated campaign to destroy his reputation, Mr. Chun is here today to tell you the truth. Then it was the defense's turn. Victoria's lead attorney was a man named Harrison Blackwell, 70 years old, silver-haired, and legendary. He'd successfully defended 3 senators, 2 Fortune 500 CEOs, and a former cabinet secretary. His opening statement was a masterclass in misdirection. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice warm and grandfatherly, "this case is about many things, but at its heart, it's about a man who saw an opportunity and took it. Marcus Chun worked as a janitor for 17 years. 17 years of pushing a cart, emptying trash, making barely enough to survive. And then one night, he found himself alone with a dying billionaire. Ask yourself, what would you do in that moment? Would you see a medical emergency? Or would you see an opportunity?" Blackwell paced slowly, letting his words sink in. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Ronald Sterling, a man suffering a fatal heart attack, somehow had the presence of mind to direct M.R. Chun to a hidden flash drive containing evidence of fraud. But there's another, much simpler explanation. M.R. Chun saw a man dying, saw an open drawer, saw an opportunity to manufacture evidence that would make him rich and famous. And that's exactly what he did." Marcus felt his hands clench under the table. Morrison had warned him about this, but hearing it said out loud, hearing his desperation and grief twisted into cold calculation, made his blood boil. "We will show you," Blackwell continued, "that Mr. Chun has a history of conflicts with authority figures, that he's been terminated from previous employment, that he made accusations against supervisors before. This is a pattern. And in this case, that pattern led him to fabricate evidence against one of the most respected businesswomen in America, all in pursuit of the substantial financial reward that comes with being a whistleblower." He paused, looking each juror in the eye. "Victoria Sterling is innocent. The evidence will show that any financial irregularities at Sterling Global were the result of sophisticated cyber attacks, not internal fraud. The real question you'll have to answer is this: Do you believe a dying man's alleged final words as reported by a janitor with a motive to lie, or do you believe in presumed innocence until proven guilty? Thank you. The rest of the first day was consumed by procedural matters and the prosecution's first witnesses. A forensic accountant walked the jury through the financial records on the flash drive, explaining in painstaking detail how the fraud had been executed. An FBI cyber expert testified that there was no evidence of external hacking, that all the suspicious transactions originated from inside Sterling Global's network. A former Sterling employee described how Victoria had consolidated power after her father's health decline, how she'd systematically removed anyone who asked too many questions. It was damning testimony presented with clinical precision, but Marcus could see some of the jurors' eyes glazing over. Financial fraud was complicated, technical, hard to follow. They needed something human, something they could connect to emotionally. They needed his testimony. It came on the second day. Morrison called Marcus to the stand just after the lunch break when the jury was most alert. He walked to the witness box on legs that felt disconnected from his body, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Morrison started gently, establishing the basics: his name, his job, how long he'd worked at Sterling Global. She led him through his typical routine, making him seem reliable, methodical, someone who showed up every day and did his work without complaint. Mr. Chun, can you tell the jury what happened on the night of October 14th? Marcus took a deep breath. This was it. He'd rehearsed this moment 100 times with Morrison, but now, with 12 strangers watching him, with Victoria's cold eyes boring into him from the defense table, the words felt impossible to form. I was doing my rounds on the 47th floor, he began, his voice steadier than he felt. I started cleaning Mr. Sterling's office around 11 p.m. The door was open, which was unusual, but I thought maybe he'd forgotten to close it. When I went inside, I found him on the floor. He walked them through everything. Finding Sterling, the CPR attempts, the old man's desperate whisper, the flash drive in the drawer. Morrison let him speak without interruption, letting the jury see and hear a man telling a simple, terrible truth. And did Mr. Sterling say anything else to you? He said, "Stop her." He was trying to tell me something about his daughter, about Victoria. He said she was going to do something, but he couldn't finish. That's when Marcus's voice caught. That's when he died. And what did you do with the flash drive? I took it home. I know I shouldn't have, but he seemed so desperate for me to have it, to keep it safe. When I looked at what was on it, I understood why. Morrison had him describe the contents of the drive, the note, the decision to come forward. With each answer, Marcus felt the weight of the courtroom's attention, the jury processing not just his words, but his demeanor, his credibility, his humanity. Then Morrison did something unexpected. She pulled out a photograph, had it marked as evidence, and showed it to Marcus. Do you recognize this? It was a picture of Sophie, taken at her mother's grave on the anniversary of her death. Marcus and Sophie were kneeling by the headstone, their arms around each other. It was a private moment, intimate and raw. "That's my daughter and me," Marcus said, his voice thick. "That's my wife's grave. The defense has suggested you came forward for money. Mr. Chun, I want you to tell the jury why you really did this." Marcus looked at Sophie, at her tear-streaked face, then at the jury. "My wife died of cancer 7 years ago. Before she passed, she made me promise something," he said. "Don't let Sophie grow up thinking that powerful people can do whatever they want and the rest of us just have to accept it. I broke a lot of promises to my wife. I couldn't save her, but I could keep that one promise. That's why I'm here." The courtroom was absolutely silent. One juror, the retired postal worker, was openly crying. Morrison nodded, satisfied. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Chun looked at the defense table. "Mr. Blackwell, your witness." Harrison Blackwell stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. His smile was pleasant, even friendly, but his eyes were those of a predator who just spotted prey. "Chun," he said, walking toward the witness stand. "Let's talk about promises." Harrison Blackwell moved with the confidence of a man who destroyed 1,000 witnesses before Marcus and would destroy 1,000 more after. He carried a leather folder, placing it carefully on the podium before turning his full attention to the witness stand. "Mr. Chun, you said you made a promise to your wife. Let's examine your track record with promises, shall we?" He pulled a document from the folder. "In 2005, you were arrested for driving under the influence. According to the police report, you had your daughter in the car. She was 12 years old." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Morrison had prepared him for this, but the reality of having his worst mistake aired in front of his daughter, in front of the world, was devastating. "Yes, that happened. You promised your wife you'd be a good father, didn't you? Yet you endangered your daughter's life by driving drunk. I made a terrible mistake. I was grieving. My wife had just been diagnosed with cancer, and I wasn't coping well, but I learned from it. I never drank again. How convenient that you found redemption just in time to be a credible witness." Blackwell's tone dripped with sarcasm. "Let's talk about another promise. In 2015, you were terminated from your position at Clearwater Management. You sued for wrongful termination, claiming you'd been fired for reporting theft. The case was dismissed, wasn't it? Yes, but not because I was lying. The company settled to avoid publicity, or perhaps because your claim was frivolous and you knew it." Blackwell didn't wait for an answer. "You have a pattern, Mr. Chun? You make accusations against employers? You position yourself as a whistleblower, and you expect to be rewarded for it. First Clearwater, now Sterling Global." Morrison stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying rather than questioning." "Sustained. Mr. Blackwell, please confine yourself to question." Blackwell smiled, unbothered. "Mr. Chun, You testified that Mr. Sterling gave you the flash drive with his dying breath. But there's no recording of this conversation, is there? No witnesses except you. He was dying. I was trying to save his life, not record our conversation. How very convenient. Tell me, when you found Mr. Sterling, did you immediately call for help? Marcus hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but Blackwell caught it like a shark scenting blood. Mr. Chun, it's a simple yes or no question. I checked his pulse first. I needed to know if he was alive, so you didn't immediately call for help. You took time to check his pulse, to listen to what he was saying, to open his drawer and remove a flash drive. How much time elapsed between finding him and calling 911? Maybe a minute. Maybe 2 minutes. Blackwell repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air. 2 minutes during which a man was dying, during which immediate medical attention might have saved his life. 2 minutes you spent rifling through his desk. That's not what happened. He told me to take it, so you say. But Mr. Sterling can't confirm that, can he? Because he's dead. Dead while you were busy stealing from his desk instead of calling for help. The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He saw several jurors shift uncomfortably, doubt creeping into their expression. This was exactly what Morrison had warned him about. Blackwell was planting a seed, making the jury wonder if Marcus had let Sterling die to steal the evidence. I did everything I could to save him, Marcus said, his voice shaking with emotion. I tried CPR. I begged him to hold on, but he was already dying when I found him. Again, so you say. Let's move on to the flash drive itself. You claim it contained evidence of fraud orchestrated by Ms. Sterling. But you're not a forensic accountant, are you? Chun? No, you're not a lawyer? No, you have no financial training beyond a high school education? That's correct. So when you looked at complex financial documents, transaction records, and accounting ledgers, you had no real ability to understand what you were seeing, did you? Marcus felt the trap closing. I understood enough. The documents were clear. Clear to an expert, perhaps, but to a layman, to someone who wanted to see fraud because it would make them a hero, make them rich, those same documents could be misinterpreted, couldn't they? I didn't misinterpret anything. The evidence speaks for itself. Blackwell smiled, a predator's expression. Does it? Let's talk about your reward. You're aware that the SEC's whistleblower program offers substantial financial compensation, correct? I am, but that's not why I came forward. Of course not. You're a humble janitor who just wants justice. But the fact remains that if Ms. Sterling is convicted, you stand to receive millions of dollars in reward money. Isn't that correct? If there's a reward, it's a byproduct of doing the right thing. Millions of dollars is quite a byproduct. Certainly more than you'd earn in several lifetimes of pushing a mop. Blackwell's contempt was barely veiled now. Mr. Chun, isn't it true that your daughter's college tuition was becoming unmanageable? That you were struggling financially? Marcus glanced at Sophie, saw the horror on her face. We were managing, were you? According to your bank records, which you helpfully provided to the prosecution. You were overdrawn 3 times in the 6 months before M.R. Sterling's death. You had less than $300 in saving. You were one emergency away from financial ruin. Many people live that way. It doesn't make me a liar, no. But it does give you a powerful motive to fabricate evidence, doesn't it? A motive to see fraud where there is none, to construct a narrative that would make you a wealthy man? Morrison objected again, and again was sustained, but the damage was done. Marcus could see it in the jury's faces. They were wondering. They were doubting. Blackwell had taken his poverty, his desperation to provide for his daughter, and weaponized it against him. The cross-examination continued for another hour. Blackwell dissected every aspect of Marcus's testimony, questioning his timing, his motives, his competence. He brought up the terminated employment, the drunk driving arrest, the financial struggles, painting a picture of a man who'd spent his life making bad decisions and accusing others to cover his own failures. By the time Judge Chun called for a recess, Marcus felt flayed open, every weakness exposed, every mistake magnified. He stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs, avoiding the jury's eyes. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Morrison pulled him aside. You did fine, I did terrible. He made me look like a desperate liar. He made you look human. People make mistakes, Marcus. The jury knows that. What matters is whether they believe your core story. And I think they do. But Marcus wasn't so sure. He'd seen the doubt in their faces, the way some of them had stopped taking notes, the skeptical expressions. Blackwell had done his job masterfully, and Marcus felt the case slipping away. Sophie found him in the witness waiting room, throwing her arms around him. I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You have nothing to apologize for. I made those mistakes. I have to own them. But the way he used them, the way he twisted everything you did into something ugly, that's what defense attorneys do, baby. He's just doing his job. Marcus held her tight, drawing strength from her presence. We knew this would be hard. That night back at the safe house, Marcus couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He lay awake, replaying every question, every answer, every moment where he'd hesitated or stumbled. Blackwell had been brilliant, and Marcus had been exactly what he'd always been. An ordinary man trying to do something extraordinary and falling short. The next morning, the prosecution called its rebuttal witnesses. Morrison brought in experts who validated the evidence on the flash drive, confirming that it showed systematic fraud. She called character witnesses who testified to Marcus's integrity. his reliability, his 17 years of faithful service. She even called the emergency dispatcher who'd taken Marcus's call the night Sterling died, who confirmed that Marcus had sounded genuinely panicked, not like someone who'd just committed a theft. But the most powerful moment came when Morrison recalled Marcus to the stand for redirect examination. "Mr. Chun, Mr. Blackwell spent considerable time questioning your motives. I want to ask you a simple question. If this was all about money, if you'd fabricated evidence to get rich, why didn't you just take the initial payment Miss Sterling offered? She offered you $250,000 to stay quiet. That's more than most whistleblowers ever see. Why didn't you take it?" Marcus looked at the jury, these 12 strangers who held his fate in their hand. "Because some things can't be bought. My daughter is watching this trial. She's watching to see what kind of man her father is. I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and corrupt. I'd rather she see me struggle to pay bills than see me sell my integrity for a check." He paused, emotion thickening his voice. "Ronald Sterling died asking me to stop his daughter from destroying everything he built. I'm not a hero. I'm not special. I'm just a man who was asked to do the right thing by someone who had no one else to ask, and I'm doing it. Whatever it costs me, whatever you think of me, keeping my promise to him." The courtroom was silent. Morrison let the moment breathe, then quietly said, "No further question." As Marcus stepped down from the witness stand for the final time, he caught Victoria Sterling's eye. For just a moment, her perfect composure cracked. He saw fear there, real fear, and he knew something she'd been trying to hide. She understood that despite everything, despite Blackwell's brilliant cross-examination and her unlimited resources, the truth was stronger than her lies. The invisible man had been seen, and he had not looked away. The trial dragged on for 3 more weeks. The prosecution methodically built its case with expert witnesses, forensic accountants, and former Sterling Global employees who testified to Victoria's increasingly erratic behavior as her father's health declined. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle, painting a picture of systematic fraud executed with cold precision over years. The defense fought back aggressively. Blackwell brought in his own experts, who argued that the financial irregularities could be explained by the cyber attic Victoria had reported. He called character witnesses who painted Victoria as a devoted daughter driven to exhaustion by caring for an ailing father while running a multi-billion-dollar company. He even had Victoria's personal assistant testify that she'd seen Ronald Sterling become increasingly paranoid and confused in his final months, suggesting that any accusatory documents might have been the product of dementia rather than truth. But Victoria herself never took the stand. Blackwell was too smart to expose her to cross-examination, too aware that Morrison would tear her apart. Her silence spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. Marcus attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecution table with Sophie beside him. He watched the jury's faces, trying to read their reactions, searching for some sign of which way they were leaning. Some days he felt hopeful. The evidence was overwhelming, and surely they could see the truth. Other days he despaired, watching jurors nod along with Blackwell's arguments, seeing doubt creep into their expressions. The media circus outside the courthouse intensified daily. The case had become a referendum on wealth inequality, corporate accountability, and whether ordinary people could stand up to the powerful and win. Marcus's face was everywhere. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse holding signs that read, "We stand with Marcus and justice for the 99%. But there were also protesters calling him a liar, a fraud, threatening violence if Victoria was convicted. The pressure was suffocating. Marcus started having nightmares about Abrams's death, about the blood on his hands, about Sophie being hurt. He'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, and have to remind himself where he was, that they were safe, that it would all be over soon. On the 23rd day of trial, both sides rested their cases. Judge Chun scheduled closing arguments for the following Monday, giving everyone a weekend to prepare. Marcus spent those 2 days in a haze of anxiety, barely eating, unable to focus on anything. Sophie tried to distract him with movies and conversation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to fall apart. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the weather matching Marcus's mood. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the back and spilling into the hallway. Judge Chun had to threaten to clear the room twice before order was restored. Catherine Morrison delivered the prosecution's closing argument with quiet intensity. She walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece, connecting the dots in a way that made Victoria's guilt seem irrefutable. She talked about the missing pension funds, the falsified reports, the elaborate cover-up, and she talked about Marcus. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defense wants you to believe that Marcus Chun is a liar, a opportunist, a man who fabricated evidence for money. But ask yourselves this, what kind of liar refuses $250,000? What kind of opportunist puts his daughter in danger, gives up his job, his home, his entire life, all for a lie? The defense has spent weeks trying to destroy MR, Chun's character, pointing to mistakes he made years ago, to struggles we can all understand. But they can't change one fundamental truth. Marcus Chun is here because a dying man trusted him with the truth. And despite everything, despite threats and attempts on his life, despite being torn apart in this courtroom, he hasn't wavered. That's not the behavior of a liar. That's the behavior of a man with integrity." She paused, looking each juror in the eye. "Ronald Sterling built his company on principles that his daughter has betrayed. He knew what she'd done. and with his dying breath he tried to stop her. Don't let his death be in vain. Don't let the powerful escape justice because they can afford better lawyers. Look at the evidence, follow the truth, and find Victoria Sterling guilty. The courtroom was silent as Morrison took her seat. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. Whatever happened next, someone had finally stood up and said what needed to be said. Then it was Blackwell's turn. The old attorney stood slowly, his performance calculated for maximum impact. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotion. He painted Victoria as a victim of a conspiracy, a successful woman targeted because of her gender and her wealth. He portrayed Marcus as a desperate man who'd constructed an elaborate lie and gotten lucky when legitimate. Cyberatics provided cover for his fabrications. The prosecution asks you to believe an incredible story, Blackwell said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. That a janitor, a man with no training, no expertise, just happened to be in the right place at the right time. That a dying man in the throes of a heart attack had the presence of mind to direct this janitor to hidden evidence. That this janitor, out of pure altruism, risked everything to expose fraud. It's a compelling narrative. It's the kind of story Hollywood loves. But ladies and gentlemen, this isn't a movie. This is real life where people lie for money, where desperate men make desperate choices, where the truth is often simpler and uglier than we want to believe. He walked to the defense table, placing his hand on Victoria's shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with what might have been tears if you didn't look too closely. Victoria Sterling is innocent. The evidence shows cyber attacks. The evidence shows a father who was confused and paranoid in his final days. The evidence shows a janitor with motive and opportunity to steal and fabricate. Don't let emotion override reason. Don't let a compelling story override fact. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They haven't. They can't, because Victoria Sterling is not guilty. Judge Chun gave the jury their instructions, explaining the charges, the burden of proof, the meaning of reasonable doubt. She reminded them that they must base their decisions solely on the evidence presented in court, not on media coverage or public opinion or sympathy for any party. You will now retire to deliberate, she said. Take all the time you need. This is one of the most important decisions you'll ever make. The jury filed out, 12 ordinary people carrying an extraordinary burden. The courtroom emptied slowly, people reluctant to leave, as if their presence might somehow influence the outcome. Marcus sat frozen in his seat, watching the door through which the jury had disappeared. Come on, Morrison said gently. There's a witness room where we can wait. This could take hours, days even, but Marcus couldn't move. Sophie had to physically pull him up, guide him out of the courtroom. In the witness room, Morrison's team tried to project confidence, but Marcus could see the anxiety beneath their professional facades. They knew as well as he did that juries were unpredictable, that all their preparation and evidence might not be enough. The hours crawled by. Marcus paced, unable to sit still. Sophie tried to read, but gave up after rereading the same page 5 times. Morrison fielded constant calls from her office, from the media, from SEC officials wanting updates. The light outside the window faded from gray to dark. At 7 p.m., word came that the jury was breaking for the night. They'd resumed deliberations in the morning. Marcus felt something inside him collapse. He'd expected a quick verdict one way or the other. The fact that they were still deliberating meant doubt, disagreement, uncertainty. The second day of deliberations was worse. Marcus felt like he was vibrating out of his skin, every nerve ending raw and exposed. By noon, reporters were speculating that a hung jury was possible, that the case might end in a mistrial. The thought of going through all of this again, of another trial, was more than Marcus could bear. At 3 p.m. on the second day, the word came. The jury had reached a verdict. The walk back to the courtroom felt like walking to his own execution. The hallways were mobbed with press, with spectators, with people who'd been following the trial and wanted to be present for the conclusion. Security had to clear a path for Marcus and Morrison to get through. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Victoria sat at the defense table, her composure finally cracking, her face pale. Blackwell whispered to her urgently, but she seemed not to hear. Marcus took his seat, Sophie's hand gripping his so tightly he lost feeling in his fingers. Judge Chun entered, and everyone rose. She instructed the jury to be brought in, and then there they were, 12 faces carefully neutral, filing into the jury box. Marcus tried to read their expressions, their body language, anything that might give him a clue, but they'd been trained well. They revealed nothing. As the jury reached a verdict, Judge Chun asked. The foreperson, Juror 3, the retired postal worker, stood. "We have, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff." The piece of paper changed hands. Judge Chun reviewed it, her face impassive. Then she handed it back. "The defendant will rise." Victoria stood, Blackwell beside her, both of them rigid with tension. Marcus felt like his heart might explode from his chest. "On the count of securities fraud, how do you find?" Foreperson's voice was clear, steady, final. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Victoria's knees buckled, Blackwell catching her. Spectators cheered and wept. Judge Chun's gavel slammed down repeatedly, calling for order. Marcus sat frozen, the word echoing in his mind. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." Sophie was sobbing, her arms around him. Morrison was shaking his hand, saying something he couldn't hear over the roaring in his ears. The jury was polled. each member confirming the verdict: guilty on all counts, guilty of fraud, of conspiracy, of destroying thousands of lives in pursuit of wealth she didn't need. Judge Chun scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later and dismissed the jury with thanks for their service. As Victoria was led away by federal marshals, she looked back at Marcus one final time. Her expression was no longer arrogant or contemptuous. It was pure, distilled hatred. But Marcus didn't care. It was over. He'd kept his promise to Ronald Sterling, to his late wife, to himself. The Invisible Man had spoken, and the world had listened. The 6 weeks between the verdict and sentencing felt like living in a strange dream. Marcus and Sophie emerged from the federal safe house to find themselves in a world that had moved on in their absence. The trial had dominated headlines, but now other stories competed for attention. The news cycle was relentless, already hungry for the next scandal, the next tragedy, the next hero or villain. But for Marcus, everything was different. He couldn't walk down the street without being recognized. Some people thanked him, tears in their eyes, telling him about parents whose pensions had been stolen, about retirement savings that had vanished. Others cursed him, blaming him for the thousands of Sterling Global employees who'd lost their jobs when the company collapsed under the weight of the scandal. He was both hero and destroyer, depending on who you asked. The whistleblower reward came through 3 weeks after the verdict: $473 million in sanctions against Sterling Global and its executives, translated to a $71 million payment to Marcus under the SEC's whistleblower program. The number was so absurd, so disconnected from any reality Marcus had ever known, that it felt meaningless. "Dad, we're millionaires," Sophie said, staring at the bank statement that had arrived via secure courier. "We're actually millionaires." Multiple times over, Marcus looked at the number, all those zeros marching across the page, and felt nothing. He thought about David Abrams, who died trying to do the same thing Marcus had done. Thought about Agent Martinez, still recovering from his injuries, his career over. He thought about Ronald Sterling, dying alone on the floor of his office. "Blood money," he said quietly. "No." Sophie's voice was fierce. "Justice money. You earned this, Dad. You risked everything. I did what I had to do, that's all." But the money was real, whether he wanted it or not. Morrison helped him establish a foundation, the Ronald Sterling Truth and Justice Fund, dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and supporting families of those who'd lost their savings to corporate fraud. Marcus kept enough to ensure Sophie could finish college without working 3 jobs, to buy a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, to have security he'd never known. The rest went to the foundation. The sentencing hearing was held on a cold October morning, exactly 1 year after Ronald Sterling's death. The courtroom was packed again, but the atmosphere was different. The circus was over. This was the reckoning. Victoria Sterling looked like a different person. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by prison-issue clothing. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She'd aged a decade in 6 weeks, the weight of her conviction visible in every line of her face. But her eyes, when they met Marcus's across the courtroom, still held that spark of fury. Judge Chun heard from the victims first. One by one, they stood and told their stories. A 70-year-old man who'd lost his entire pension and now worked as a greeter at a big box store. A woman whose retirement dreams of traveling had evaporated, who now lived with her children because she couldn't afford rent. A former Sterling Global employee who'd lost both his job and his savings in a single catastrophic week. Their pain was raw, real, devastating. Then Morrison read a statement on behalf of David Abrams' family. His widow described a man who'd been haunted by his complicity, who'd wanted to make things right but had been too afraid, until Marcus's courage had inspired him to act, and it had cost him his life. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he kept it brief. "Your Honor, Victoria Sterling didn't just steal money. She stole futures. She stole security. She stole the trust people place in the systems that are supposed to protect them." I hope the sentence reflects the magnitude of that betrayal. Finally, Judge Chun spoke. Her voice was measured, but there was steel beneath it. "Ms. Sterling, you were born into privilege beyond what most people can imagine. You had every advantage, every opportunity, and you used those advantages not to serve others but to exploit them. You stole from people who trusted you, who depended on you. When your own father tried to stop you, you let him die knowing you destroyed his legacy. And when people threatened to expose your crimes, you had them killed." Victoria's lawyers started to object, but Judge Chun held up a hand. "Miss Sterling has not been convicted of murder, and I acknowledge that. But the evidence of her involvement in David Abrams' death, while insufficient for criminal charges, speaks to a consciousness of guilt and a willingness to do anything to protect herself." She paused, looking down at Victoria with something close to contempt. "The sentencing guidelines suggest a range of 25 to 30 years, but the magnitude of your fraud, the number of lives you destroyed, and your complete lack of remorse demand more. I am sentencing you to 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." The gavel came down with finality. Victoria's scream echoed through the courtroom as marshals led her away. It was the first genuine emotion Marcus had ever seen from her, raw and desperate and too late. Outside the courthouse, Marcus faced the cameras one final time. The questions came rapid fire, overlapping, a wall of sound. He raised his hand and gradually the noise died down. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I'm just someone who was asked to do something difficult and decided to do it anyway. The real heroes are the people whose lives were destroyed by corporate greed and who are somehow finding the strength to rebuild. The real heroes are people like David Abrams, who paid the ultimate price for trying to do the right thing." He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd, so many strangers who felt connected to his story. "For 17 years, I was invisible. I pushed a cart, I cleaned floors, and nobody saw me. And then one night, a dying man gave me a chance to be seen. Not because I wanted fame or money, but because sometimes the invisible people are the only ones paying attention. We see things others miss. We hear things others ignore. And sometimes we're the only ones who can tell the truth." A reporter shouted a question about his plans for the future. Marcus smiled, a real smile, and wrapped his arm around Sophie's shoulders. "I'm going to watch my daughter graduate from college. I'm going to help people who want to speak up but are afraid. And I'm going to live my life knowing that when it mattered most, I didn't stay quiet." 3 months later, Marcus stood in a small office in downtown Manhattan. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but the sign on the door read Chun Whistleblower Support Services. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't glamorous, but it was his and it was real. The first client was a young woman who worked as a home health aide for a company that was defrauding Medicare. She was terrified, barely able to speak, convinced that coming forward would destroy her life. Marcus sat across from her, remembering how he'd felt in that coffee shop with Rebecca Walsh, and he understood her fear intimately. "I can't promise this will be easy," he told her. "I can't promise you won't lose things that matter, but I can promise that you won't be alone. I can promise that your voice will be heard, and I can promise that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it costs you everything, is worth it." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "How do you know?" Marcus thought about everything he'd lost and everything he'd gained. The fear, the threats, the months of living in limbo, but also the moment when the jury said guilty, the moment when justice against all odds had prevailed. The knowledge that he'd kept his promise to a dying man and to his late wife. "Because I've been where you are," he said simply, "and I survived it. You will too." She signed the papers, began the process, took the first terrifying step, and Marcus, who'd spent 17 years being invisible, helped guide her into the light. That evening he came home to find Sophie cooking dinner, music playing, her textbooks spread across the kitchen table. She was thriving at school, planning to become a social worker, dedicated to helping people the system overlooked. She'd been shaped by everything they'd been through, made stronger by the fire. "How was your day?" she asked, the domestic normalcy of the question making them both smile. "Good. Help someone find their courage. Like father, like daughter. Then, I did the same in my practicum today." They ate dinner together, talking about ordinary things, school and work and weekend plans. Outside, the city glowed with millions of lights, millions of lives, millions of stories. Some of those people were invisible, just as Marcus had been, but he knew now that invisible didn't mean powerless. Sometimes the invisible people were the ones who changed everything. Later, alone in his small home office, Marcus looked at the photograph on his desk. It showed him and Sophie outside the courthouse after Victoria's sentencing. They looked tired, older, marked by what they'd endured, but they also looked strong, unbroken. He thought about the question Victoria had asked him in that black sedan before everything had fallen apart. She'd asked if he understood how things worked, the way power protected power, the way the system crushed anyone who challenged it. He'd understood perfectly. He just hadn't accepted it. And in the end, that had made all the difference. Marcus Chun had been invisible for 17 years. But when it mattered most, when a dying man placed truth in his hands, and the world waited to see what he'd do with it, he'd chosen to be seen. Not for money, not for fame, but because some things mattered more than comfort or safety. The invisible man had spoken, and the world had changed because of it.